He held the baby like an accusation, and the infant stared at him with hollowed cheeks and a small, willful silence that felt like betrayal. Luca Moretti's fingers trembled as if the weight of his world had been condensed into this one fragile, heatless body. He rocked, he whispered, he threatened God with the kind of prayer he'd never used on the streets or in boardrooms. The nursery lights hummed above marble and monitors that had no place in a room meant for lullabies, and every machine flashed a polite, indifferent green that did nothing for his panic. "Eat," he commanded, because ordering was what he did, and for the first time, the world would not comply. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. His consigliere, Marcello, stood in the doorway with a face like a ledger, calcified, unreadable, and the two bodyguards behind him looked as if panic had been assigned for a specific shift and they'd been told to carry on. The feeding pump sat on a side table, its tubes looped like surrendered ropes. Bottles lined the counter in the kitchenette the size of a courtroom gallery, each sterilized and tagged with the signature of the family nurse who had tended Moretti infants for decades. The baby had refused all of them for 3 days. 3 days, and something unnameable began to fracture inside Luca, a slow, precise undermining of the conviction that had kept his empire balanced on the point of his will. "Call Dr. Ferry again," Marcello said, voice even, the kind of even that hides a blade. "Private pediatrician, neonatal specialist, whatever you need. Get a nasal swab, blood work, immunology. We'll fly him to Geneva if we have to." Luca closed his eyes. A laugh, strangled and small, escaped him. "You can't fix this with a charter." He pressed the infant to his chest, feeling the tiny ribcage stutter. "You can't fix electricity with invoices?" Marcello's jaw tightened. "Then call someone who can. Someone who could, or someone who would not judge him. Someone who would step over the invisible line between the Morettis and the service staff." The building had been in the family for 3 generations. Limestone facade, Art Deco lobby, the kind of elevators that still knew the names of people who'd moved out decades ago. It hummed with air conditioning and secrets. Anna arrived 3 nights a week after midnight to mop a corridor that smelled of lemon sanitizer and old money. She moved through the floors like wind, efficient, unobtrusive, her uniform a second skin. Nobody in House Moretti remembered to ask her name beyond the indifferent roll call. She kept her phone off-grid, not a choice for privacy, but for survival. There were debts at home that could not be explained to anyone whose last name opened safe deposit boxes. A sister with tremors who called at ungodly hours begging for bus fare. Student loans with interest like shackles. And a private grief folded so tight inside her that it had the shape of a lost baby. Maria, the baby she had fed until the system tore them apart 6 years earlier. When Luca's secretary, someone whose surname meant something like loyalty on paper and expedient in practice, called Anna's name down the polished halls and asked if she could return to the nursery tonight, if she would come and sit with the baby who had stopped eating, Anna thought it was some mistake. The Morettis did not ask favors from cleaners, except when the favor required no human warmth. But "come in" had a weight in it. It sounded like a command, softened. She agreed because she had no better lie to give. She told herself she would be a shadow, sit, watch, do what was needed, and leave. The night she arrived in the nursery, she smelled the citrus polish and the faint peppermint of the nurse's hand cream. The baby smelled like no baby she'd ever held, sterile, scrubbed into the shape of someone else's grief. Luca handed the infant to her with the same guarded confusion he used to handle lithe parts of his empire, as if any wrong move could trigger a collapse. Anna had breastfed until her milk dried up. Her body had known the language of hunger and the answer to it once, in a way she had never told anyone. She had kept that part of herself like a secret ember, meaningless, dangerous, and warm. When the infant's small mouth opened toward her, reflex moved before ideology, and Anna ducked her head and wept once into the crook of his neck. The baby nuzzled, tasted, and then, for reasons Anna could not explain and Luca could not tolerate in his equations of power, latched. The latch was not picturesque. It was raw and urgent, and the baby ate with a hunger that made the pipes of the building seem a chorus. They sat like that for an hour, the three adults arranged like a secret around the infant. Luca with his control fracturing into tenderness. Marcello watching with the worn suspicion of a man used to protecting reputations. And Anna, whose own past folded into this act like a sacrament and a gamble. When the baby finally fell asleep, full and limp, Luca looked at Anna with something between gratitude and disbelief, and a dangerous curiosity he'd never allow himself to feel about a person so invisible. "You work for me," he said, the words blunt but not accusatory. "You've been quietly invisible in the halls of my buildings for years. Why have I not known you?" She could have said the truth. "I have things to hide. I sleep with my phone off because the men who hunt debts use their networks like dogs. I have a sister who needs a clean syringe now and then. I have a child I still carry." But instead, she chose silence. The wrong answer was a risk she couldn't take. "I do my job," Anna said. Her accent had the soft edges of neighborhoods he rarely visited. It carried both defiance and a caution that made Luca's curiosity deeper. "And I keep my head down. This is how the first fissure formed, not in thunder, but in an intimate exchange that belonged in a different life." Luca had built his power on information, on knowing where a rival would move before they did, on reading the market like a lover reads a face. Anna had built her life on absence and quiet strength. The baby, Luca's blood, heir to a line that made fortunes and ruination, had been given back a measure of life by the woman the family had always assigned to mop up after them. The next morning, the building hummed with rumors like insects. Staff who'd been told to keep their eyes down found reasons to look up. The night nurse, long loyal to the Morettis, changed her tone when Luca asked about protocol. "We never," she began, trailing off when he lifted a hand. Marcello proposed a sanitized explanation. The baby had small taste issues, a temporary aversion, nothing to make headlines. But Luca's instinct that ran deeper than market maneuvers began to twist. He had always believed that control was the best defense against enemies. Now, his son's small body had become a loophole in the walls he had built. The family could handle a scandal. They could not allow a weakness that invited enemies to probe. A leak, someone said, would be merciless. In the age where his syndicate trafficked in data as casually as contraband, a smear could be coded into an exposé overnight and weaponized by anyone who wanted to push him. "The world will see what it wants," Marcello said. "They'll make it into a symbol. They'll say you're soft. You'll be targeted. Alliances will shift." Luca felt the old response rise. Protect the family's image at all costs. But the infant slept against Anna's heartbeat like a small, insistent key. Protecting the child tonight meant changing a rule that no one had allowed him to rewrite in decades. He moved through the city like a man who'd never cry. Now he considered asking for something that would expose both him and the cleaner to the claws of public shaming. Control or compassion, he discovered with a disabling sort of clarity that they were not always aligned. For Anna, the stakes were just as precise and different. She could walk away and reclaim her anonymity. She could refuse to be anything other than what the world allowed, an invisible hand that sanitized stains and then vanished. But the taste of a child at her breast pulled at the ragged parts of her heart. It rewired a grief that had been tucked under her sternum. To refuse now would be to deliver herself once again into the orbit of a system that fed on loss. To accept would be to invite scrutiny that could pull up the past. Exposure to men whose networks overlapped with the hackers she'd known in a previous life. People who still whispered in dark corners about codes and leverage. When Luca asked later that day if she would consider staying on as a private caregiver until the doctors were certain, if she would come into a role no Moretti had ever asked her to take, Anna felt every muscle remember a past million small humiliations. She felt the antibiotic edge of possibility. Money would matter, of course. The salary he offered would put debts in the rearview mirror and buy her sister a week's worth of clean syringes. But the offer smelled of more than guile. It smelled of something dangerous and catalytic. A chance to sit at a table that had, until now, been reserved for men whose names were carved into marble. She thought of the little clandestine feedings she'd managed in the past when strangers needed warmth and she had given it like contraband. She thought of Maria's small face and of a maternal urge that had never dulled. This time, the object of her care would be the grandson of a man who could wipe out her entire block with a single corporate move. It was not just a question of risk. It was a question of what kind of woman she wanted to be. One who always fled the borders of comfort, or one who, for once, stepped over the line and did something scandalous and sacred. The choice she made that evening, after the baby's cheeks filled out under her breast, and Luca watched with a mouth that did not form a smile, a new kind of damage softening his features, was both survival and something wobbling more like desire. She agreed to stay. Everyone in Luca's circle expected gratitude and an immediate retraction. The cleaner would bow, leave, and the world would reset. But the truth was messier. A quiet tenderness began to form in the fissures. Luca, who had never known how to be small, learning to trust. Anna, who had never asked for much, accepting the dangerous gift of proximity to power. Both felt the world tilt. Both felt that this night could become an entire life if it did not get blown apart first. And somewhere, in the arteries of the city, a rival started drafting a digital arrow that smelled like blood and scandal, counting on the first sign of weakness to pull the empire down. They asked for proof like they always did, with the blunt instruments of skepticism and protocol, but Anna gave them something else, a slow, ordinary miracle. When the baby came awake, blinking milk-fogged eyes at the world, she whispered songs she hadn't sung in years, lullabies borrowed from mothers in rooms much smaller than this nursery. Luca sat on the edge of the bassinet and watched as the infant reached blindly for her hair, as if it recognized a pattern of care embedded in the smell of her skin. Marcello watched too, more closely now, cataloging the moment like a man who was learning a new ledger, gratitude balanced against risk. The first week stitched itself into rules that no Moretti household had ever needed to write down. Anna arrived before midnight, stole through the corridors with the quiet certainty of someone who carried more than mops, memories, debts, a secret ache, and she left when the sky was bruising with dawn. She prepared bottles and sometimes refused to prepare them because the baby had learned to prefer the warmth at her chest to the metal teeth of a teat. Nurse Fairy visited, perplexed and polite. She took samples, made charts with her pen, and called it atypical feeding behavior, in tones meant to hold space for mystery without admitting fear. The specialists Luca tried to hire could not diagnose hunger. They could not name the place where this infant's appetite had gone. They could only note the science of it and the family of oddities that surrounded it. For Luca, those nights were a kind of suspension. He moved through them like a man learning to breathe through a new wound. He took calls in the nursery sometimes, the speakerphone soft, while Anna hummed like a steady machine in the corner. He negotiated with kings of commerce and the heads of digital syndicates while rocking the air in his lap. Deals were inked and enemies deterred with the same thumb that smoothed the infant's forehead. During board calls, his voice softened. Executives used words like restructuring and acquisition, while a barely audible suckle marked time at the edge of his attention. It unmoored him in ways no rival ever had. Anna noticed things about Luca that the public never saw. How his hands trembled when the world shrank to a single body. How his jaw unclenched in the middle of the night as if some pressure valve had finally been opened. How, once, he sang one line of an old song under his breath and then looked mortified at his own softness. She learned how he liked his coffee, black, almost violent in its bitterness, and how he never ate in the nursery, as if any smell besides baby powder might offend the small truce they were trying to build. For her, the work offered more than money. It offered proof that tenderness could exist in rooms dominated by stone and screens. It offered the dangerous possibility that someone powerful could be unexpectedly human. But tenderness is porous in a city like theirs. News, or the version of it that mattered to men who traffic in reputations, is not a random thing. It is curated, planted, and detonated. The first whisper slipped out like steam under a door. The boss has a cleaner nursing his grandson. At first it was a sordid joke told in staff rooms, then a rumor in the underground coffee shops where couriers and low-level techs swapped information for attention. Then it got coded into the nets where enemies lounged, looking for weak seams to pull. Luca expected attacks, always had, but he had not expected the particular cruelty of this one. The smear came dressed in honeyed indecency. Hacked photos of the nursery, cropped to imply scandal, a fabricated insider quote about impropriety, and an algorithm-boosted thread that looped his name with words like softness and exposure. That very first morning, the Moretti legal department produced a memo that smelled like threat: control narrative, deny, and punish leaks. Marcello tightened his shoulders the way a man does when he polishes steel. "We can bury this," Marcello said in the low hours, his voice an invoice for anxiety. "We can buy feeds, shift algorithms, pressure networks. We neutralize the source and the rumor dies." Neutralize how? Luca asked, though he knew the ledger of blood and influence that could be opened when a man like him wanted silence. What did neutralize mean when the person at the center of the rumor was not a politician or an opponent, but a woman who had never asked anything of him except to sweep his floors? Anna felt the world tilt under her feet. She had stepped forward because she had been needed and because the work had fed a hollow place in her chest. Now she watched the machinery of the Moretti family hum around her like a beast that could swallow her whole. She had not imagined herself a target. Her past lived in the small networks she still trusted. A handful of hackers she once knew who owed her favors for reasons she no longer cared to explain. A childhood friend who watched for cops and collected gossip for coins. None of that prepared her for the phone that buzzed once, twice, and revealed a name she had kept distant. The name of someone from the hacker cell she drifted from 5 years before. "Stay off the feeds," Luca instructed the morning the first headlines hit. "Do not go out. Do not talk to anyone. My people will handle it." The order felt like charity and like a leash. Anna agreed because the sound of his voice contained a vulnerability she did not want to exploit, and because the money would clear a month's worth of debts and buy her sister more stability. But she also felt a flicker, something like rebellion, in the way she bristled inside. The idea of being hidden away for the sake of another man's image rankled in a place wound up tight with pride. She had fed a child once and paid the price with silence. She would not accept being quietly erased now that the world wanted to use her as a symbol. She reached out to the one person she still trusted, Mateo, a wiry ex-hacker who ran a small repair shop in the South Quarter, fingers stained with solder like prayer. Mateo had helped her once, years ago, by wiping a debt ledger's digital trail so a landlord couldn't evict her sister. He answered her call on the second ring, voice low, and when she asked him to look into the leak, all he said was, "You sure you want me in this? This is Murray." "I don't know what I want," she said. "I want my sister to have clean syringes. I want this baby to be safe. I want—" She stopped because the rest sounded like a prayer to a God who did not hear people like her. Mateo took the task like he took most favors, with a grin that hid worry. "Fine, I'll look. But if this is a plant, if someone's trying to bait you, don't react. Let me find the signal. And Anna?" He paused. "Watch him. Watch Luca. He's more fragile than he looks. Watch him." The thought made her stomach flutter, a nervous, forbidden thing. She thought of Luca steering markets and burying rivals. She thought of him rocking a baby to sleep and humming under his breath. She thought of the way his eyes sometimes met hers and asked silent questions she had no right to answer. That was the other danger. Not data or smear, but the slow, insistent leak of feeling into places that had been barricaded for years. As the digital smear grew, other pressures mounted in worked, human ways. The consigliere, accordingly, suggested a public relations counter. Staged photos of Luca at a charity gala, smiling with dignified distance from the infant. A press release about family privacy and unfounded rumors. Luca agreed to some of it, more as an act of appeasement than conviction. He was a man who knew the theater of power and how to use it, but part of him bristled at the idea of making Anna into a prop. She had not performed for him, she had fed his grandson. That was less easily smoothed into a narrative he could control. The family council met behind closed doors, the room full of faces that had been used to declaring destiny for generations. Some argued for dismissal, a clean cut, a warning to everyone else who might see the Morettis as soft. Others argued for containment and a demonstration of unity. Luca listened, the infant's name like a bell at the center of his attention. He felt pressure radiate outward, the market watchers, the digital alliances, the men who counted him as a rival. He also felt something domestic and stubborn, the baby's small fingers wrapped around his own, and a memory of his son's laugh in another life. When Luca finally stood up to speak, his voice had the calm of a man who had decided on a harder kind of mercy. "We will not punish someone for saving family," he said. The room did not applaud. There was a silence thick enough to be measured. Marcelo's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. "We will protect her," Luca added. "We will do it quietly and thoroughly. Whoever leaked this will be found. Whoever weaponizes it will regret it." It was a choice that split loyalties. Some saw it as weakness. Others saw it as calculation. Better to appear humane than cold. The message that filtered outward was confusing and efficient in equal measure. The Morettis retreated into a defensive posture. Legal teams scrubbed, security tightened, feeds bought and forged for a counter-narrative. The smear still crawled over the web like mold, but it couldn't take root completely. The same networks that could weaponize an image could also drown it in data. For now, the scandal receded into a dull outline. But protection cost. It required resources and favors, and each favor was currency in a world where debts were never erased. Luca paved with measures that were impossible to overlook. Awarded private channel for Anna, guards assigned to discreet posts, a shell charity to explain the storyline for the press if asked. These moves bought time, but did not solve the deeper questions. Who in Luca's circle would believe his choice to protect Anna was virtue and not vulnerability? Who would see in his act a crack they could pry open? Meanwhile, Anna tried to live in both shapes of her new life. She practiced being invisible again when necessary, wearing the old uniform, slipping through service doors, and allowed herself private moments of wonder when the baby reached for her and smiled as if he recognized the pattern of warmth. She walked the city with new money in her pocket and old shame in her chest. She paid off the worst bills and bought her sister more stability, and for the first time in years, she slept some nights without the gnawing fear of what would happen if the light went out in their apartment. At the same time, the fear of exposure kept a cold hand on her back. Matteo reported oddities in the net, false trails and fake sources that suggested a professional hand at work. Someone wanted the Moretti's weakened, and they had chosen a tender place as their first strike. Anna's own past with hackers gave her an uneasy intuition. Leaks are not random, and they aren't about truth. They are about leverage. One evening, after the city had been scrubbed to its nocturnal colors and the nursery lights glowed like a safe harbor, Luca walked her to the service door as if escorting someone to a gate that might close forever. He did not look like a boss then. He looked like a man who feared losing the smallness he had been allowed to hold. "You could go," he said quietly, the words almost shameful. "I can make sure no one touches you. We can pay for anything you need." Anna looked at him and thought of all the things a man like him could offer: houses, payments, legal shields. But she also thought of the way his voice had wavered when he spoke her name. She saw, in that wavering, a possibility she had not been allowed to imagine. "I don't want to be bought," she told him. "I want to choose." He looked at her, and for a moment he seemed younger than his name warranted. "Then choose to stay." She did. It was an answer that felt like more than survival. It felt like a risk recalibrated into hope. But risks beget reactions. In a world that trafficked equally in favors and threats, the smallest kindness could be rendered nuclear by enemies clever enough to twist compassion into a weapon. The night ended with the baby asleep and the city buzzing with data and old grudges. Anna walked home with a new weight in her chest, one that was not only the ledger of debts or the secret of a lost child, but a small, incandescent sense that the life she had been given to hold might just be the thing that changed everything. The first blade that found them was not made of metal, but of code. It arrived in the late morning seep of sunlight, a smear in Luca's inbox and on every screen he owned. A cache of hacked footage, grainy and intimate, culled from a maintenance camera no one knew still pointed toward the service corridor. The angle was merciless. Anna's profile as she slid past the door. The nursery door left ajar. The soft slosh of a nursing gown. The image was captioned in the kind of language to humiliate and inflame. Moretti's mistress of milk. The file attached itself to message boards and encrypted chat rooms with the ease of a contagion. Within an hour, the city's low-level feeds had been fed and amplified. Marcello found Luca hunched over the screen, his face no longer the marble mask of the morning, but a map of something raw and new. The old guard in the room moved like vultures around a fresh body of policy and precedent. "Who leaked the camera?" Marcello demanded. "Whose hand?" "We'll pull server logs," Luca said, but his voice had a tremor that made paper sound like glass. "We'll trace it. Whoever thought to angle that camera knew what they were doing." "Then fetch them," Marcello ordered. "Find the node, cut the line, make it look like one of our PR stunts. We bury it. We control the narrative. You can't control what everyone already sees," Luca interrupted sharply. "You can't undo 1,000 hands sharing a single file." It was the word that kept repeating in Luca's head: exposure. Not the exposure of a deal gone wrong, or a list of names leaked, but the exposure of intimacy, something soft and private turned into scandal. The idea that Anna might be dragged into tabloids and street gossip sickened him in a way that no boardroom betrayal ever had. He felt something like fury and another, thinner thing that tasted like guilt. For Anna, the betrayal cut differently. She had known, in the quiet geometry of breaches and backdoors, that cameras were everywhere. Her past had taught her to move with the assumption of being watched. But this was not surveillance for security. This was a hunt. Someone had combed through hours of footage to find the angle that would make her into a weapon against a family that had never looked at her twice. Her phone vibrated in a pocket she no longer used much. The screen lit up with a text from Matteo. 2 words. They're inside. He didn't need to say more. The terse syntax meant an infiltration of systems, a professional hand. She swallowed bile and felt both the heat of fear and a cold resolve. If someone was using her image to wound Luca, there was a person with a stake in that wound. Someone with the appetite to break the Morettis by exposing the human fissures in their armor. The Moretti house, which had tolerated Anna as an invisible presence, now erupted into a theater of accusations. Some staff whispered that she had made a power play, that she had used intimacy to buy safety. Others accused Luca of indulgence, of letting sentiment cloud judgment. A cousin, distant enough to crave relevance, railed in private that the family's enemies would see softness and press harder. Marcello convened a sweep of vulnerability. Private investigators, internal audits, a list of every person, contractor, nurse, cleaner, who had keys to the corridors. But the truth is that the people who wanted the Morettis destroyed did not wait for a list. They started to compose their narrative litanies on their own terms. The hacked footage was curated into extras. Whispered confessions from a purported insider who claimed Anna had been on the payroll of a rival faction for months. A doctored email alleging payments made to hacktivist cells. A montage spliced with shots implying a more scandalous intimacy. The smear was not interested in truth. It was interested in ruin. Anna felt the walls close in. She had been a phantom in Luca's world, and now she was a spotlight. Her sister called, voice shaking, and asked if it was true. Neighbors on the block whispered as she walked past, their eyes scooping out a new story that reframed everything they thought they knew about loyalty and class. Matteo's messages were shorter now, moving in bursts. It's professional. Someone scheduled feed drops. Could be a rival or a political op. They left breadcrumbs. Too clean. Someone wants a war. The family did what families do. They searched for a scapegoat. The night nurse was interrogated. The maintenance crew was audited. A contract cleaner from a 3rd floor, a man who had once been dismissed for petty theft, was detained and questioned until he cried. The police were called, but the police are often an arm of systems they can't always outrun. The net widened and caught professional hands and terrified innocents alike. Anna watched men she barely knew be treated like suspects and felt a surge of something like guilt. Her very presence, her choice to feed a child in need, had started a chain reaction that crushed lesser people under its wheels. Conversations in the Moretti boardroom grew sharper. If this is a plant, Marcello said in one tense meeting, then someone inside is cooperating with an external group. Others nodded, and the names they listed were the usual suspects: rival syndicates, disgruntled ex-executives, politicians with scores to settle. But Luca heard a different sound in the council's words, a hunger for blood that would soothe the clan's bruised pride. "Find the leak," he repeated. "No grace, no mercy." That very night, while the city slept like a beast with 1,000 soft claws, someone attempted to make Anna pay for what she'd given. A package arrived at her sister's apartment, slipped under the door like a threat. It contained photos, some genuine, some altered, of Anna in ways arranged to humiliate. On the back of the images were letters, thin black scrawls that suggested exposure unless she left the Moretti household at once. The letter read like a contract in fear. "Leave, or we publish everything. We can erase you in a week." Anna's hands went cold, but she did not leave. She had expected to be used, perhaps, but not to be threatened like a small private ember by people who trafficked in leverage. The choice to stay had been partly practical, money to pay off sisters and debts, but it was also ethical, stubborn. She had fed a child. She had not consented to blackmail. When she told Luca, he was impossible. The fury that rose from him was not theatrical. It was pure predator. He called a council of shadows and lawyers and men who did not sleep to arrange a trap. "We will not be extorted," he told Marcello. "We will find them, and we will—" He stopped, the rage folding into something quieter and more dangerous. He could have burned the city to ash in a fit of retribution. Instead, he used the things he did best: networks of influence, financial pressure, and a list of favors owed. Yet even as he mobilized his resources outward, the cleavage was widening inward. The family did not like that he had chosen to protect a cleaner. His action had become an invitation to split allegiances. A cousin who had long counted on his favor began to curry distance. A trusted board member suggested a strategic dismissal to sanitize optics. Marcello watched these shifts with a ledger's calm, but Luca could see the lines forming like ghost fractures. The veneer of loyalty was thin. Worst of all, a different secret started to unspool, one that cut deeper than rumors or smear. Someone in Anna's past had been watching the Morettis for reasons that were not entirely personal. Anna had told herself she'd left that life, had walked away from small-time hacks and favors. But in the underways of the city, past alliances rarely die. The hackers she once knew were pragmatic and patient. One of them, a woman called Sarah, who had owed Anna a years ago kindness, messaged with a clipped, urgent curiosity. "Why would you nurse the boss's boy?" Sarah asked. "There's talk. We can monetize this. Or protect you. Which do you want?" That question opened a wound. If Sarah and her cohort had data, they could either sell it to the highest bidder or bury it. Anna had always believed in survival over justice, but now she felt the ethical gravity of what protecting or selling could mean. She thought of Luca watching the baby sleep, of the small iron thread of tenderness she had helped stitch. She thought of the nights in which she had fed Maria, and of the loss that still ached like a knot in her sternum. Sarah's message was a gray doorway. When Anna chose to contact Matteo again for a countermeasure, she demanded more than the quiet scans he could give. She asked for active disruption, false trails, ghost nodes, a digital smokescreen that would make the hacked footage trace back to someone else entirely. Matteo hesitated. The cost would be high. He explained the ethics in a way Anna understood. "We can mislead them, Anna. But when we fight code with code, someone always pays. Are you willing to put other people in the line of fire?" It was a calculus she had never wanted to perform. Her decision to stay had been about feeding a child, and maybe about a strange, new affection for a man who had been untouchable. But to step into a digital cat and mouse would mean weaponizing her own exposure. It would mean turning the city's machinery of shame into a battleground. It would mean cooperating with the very networks that had once ripped families apart. Meanwhile, more fractures appeared where she'd least expected, in the nursery itself. Nurse Fairy, who had worn professional reserve like armor, began to avoid Aina. Her eyes averted, and the hospital-grade tenderness became clinical coldness. "We cannot have staff seen in this way," Fairy said once, in a whisper that resounded like a verdict. "It's bad for our practice. People will question our standards." Luca, who had once stared across conference tables and made men squirm, now found himself needing to soothe tiny betrayals. People who believed scandal could be contained by purges of personality. He was shadowed by men who told him the only true solution was to cut Aina loose and make an example. He had to choose between the hunger for a clean ledger and a new kind of stubborn personal mercy. The pressure on Anna intensified. Her sister's apartment received more anonymous letters. Her neighbor lost his job after being accused online of sheltering a scandal. A hacker forum posted her name, then her sister's. The world contracted into a circle of threats that moved like tides. The decision she faced, stay and be weaponized, or leave and survive, felt like the hinge on which everything would turn. The fracture moment came when an email arrived in Luca's inbox from an ostensibly neutral newsroom. Confirm or deny? Is the Moretti grandson being breastfed by household staff? It was a thinly veiled ultimatum. To deny would be to lie, to confirm would be to inflame. Luca felt the room tilt again. He thought of the infant's small hands, of Anna's steadying presence, of the slim, fragile thing that would be the future of everything he'd built. He looked at Anna and saw the small tremor in her jaw, the way she clenched her hands to keep them from quivering. He saw the city waiting like a jury of 1,000 strangers. In choosing how to answer, Luca realized he was choosing what kind of man he would be. One who preserved myth with coldness, or one who protected tenderness even if it cost him collateral damage in his world. Anna had always known that there would be a bill for tenderness. She had thought it would be debts and loneliness. She had not foreseen the ledger of public humiliation, of blackmail and strategy. The fracture was not a single event, but a slow, inevitable peeling back of layers. The city's appetite for spectacle, the family's need to survive, Anna's own past threading into the present. Each choice they made from now on would either knit the seams of their fragile alliance tighter or rip them open beyond repair. And somewhere, in the webbed corridors of their enemies, people who counted reputations as currency sharpened their knives. They watched, waited for a slip, a misstep. For in such worlds, compassion can be framed as weakness, and weakness is an invitation. The Morettis had weathered storms built from steel and money. This one was woven from a softer, more dangerous thing: human error, human care, both of which carried the power to destroy or redeem in equal measure. The knock came like a detonated second-hand panic, sharp, intentional, timed to make everyone in the house sit up and listen to the possibility of war. Luca opened the nursery door himself. The hallway smelled of lemon and expensive fear. A courier stood there with a tablet, his eyes darting as if he expected a bullet to be behind the polished wood. On the screen, a video, time-stamped, labeled with the name of an account known to trade in secrets. The first frame held Anna at the nursery threshold, the baby asleep in her arms. The next frame jumped to a staged video montage of doctored audio, insinuations, and a montage of faces that the uploader wanted readers to conflate: Anna, an old photo of a rival lieutenant, and shot after manipulated shot that suggested a broader conspiracy. The message below read, "Expose or be exposed." Luca felt heat do the thing he had never allowed himself to feel in public: shame that belonged to him and not to the ledger. He could have followed the ledger's instruction: crush, scare, and silence. He had the mechanics to make the smear vanish. He also had the mechanics to make enemies vanish. But this was not a business metric he could optimize. This was human exposure and a child whose breath had become the axis of choices that had teeth. Marcello's voice was a scalpel. We find the source, we neutralize it quietly. We buy silence where we can't compel it. He spoke like a man used to decisions that ended in blood or bank transfers. We do not negotiate on principle. We protect the family. Luca thought of Anna's hands, the way she moved with a graceless humility that was not weakness but survival. He imagined headlines running with images that would let the world call him soft. He imagined Hunter Syndicate memos pointing at weakness like a map. He imagined Anna's sister's trembling calls. He imagined the infant's easy sleep when she hummed. For once, he let an equation dissolve into feeling. "We do not make her the target of our defense," he said. The room inhaled and then refused to follow. They had always contained damage by sacrificing lesser reputations. To some, Anna was merely lesser. To Luca, she had become something else, a moral obligation now tethered to his name. We protect her, and we find the person who weaponized this. Lessons will be public, mercy will not be. Marcello did not like the word, nor did many faces around the table. But he listened because loyalty to Luca had been earned in fights that left scars on both men. They mobilized differently now. Legal teams to counter the smear, cybersecurity to trace the source, a private liaison with a media house Luca controlled enough to ask for discretion. They also called favors in other currencies, old debts cashed, threats made, and then washed with money until they gleamed. The net tightened. The smear receded from the immediate feeds but did not die. It became an ember in the dark social spaces where narratives are crafted and kept alive. Anna watched the choreography of power at a distance she had never been invited to occupy before. Luca's world moved in rapid, clean strokes, people she'd only seen in portraits suddenly animated and furious. She felt the house's protective muscles flex for her sake, and with that flex came a new, peculiar vulnerability. Gratitude that tasted like debt. She wanted to refuse it, to leave and live small and unremarked, but she had seen how the infant's jaw had filled with milk and relished the trust that followed. She could not unchoose the tenderness of those nights. Then came the first violent knock at the door that couldn't be smoothed with money. A car slowed outside Anna's sister's apartment. A man, the kind you don't stop to identify if you value the rest of your life, stepped from the shadows and pressed a folded paper under the door. The note smelled of a threat and imperative. "Public tomorrow. Leave the Morettis by sundown or we publish everything and more." The handwriting was crisp, practiced. Someone wanted leverage. Luca's men found the courier's route, clean, deliberate, with obfuscation designed to frustrate a trace. They found the intermediary, a small-time agent whose pockets had once been lined by Moretti favors and now emptied by fear. He talked too much under pressure and eventually whispered a lead, a known fixer who sold narrative hits to the highest bidder. The trail led deeper than anyone wanted, toward factions that had long wanted to shove the Morettis out of influential councils. Someone was staging a campaign of entropy, not for money, but to see what would fall off the family when they were forced to choose. In a cramped room above a locksmith's in the old quarter, Matteo worked his fingers until they buzzed with solder and worry. He sent Anna fragments of code that tracked bot signatures, IP white noise, the smell of proxy servers. He found a vector that suggested a bitter operant, not merely a rival, but a coalition of bot journalists and exasperated politicians eager for a morality tale they could sell. The narrative had teeth because it spoke to a world willing to moralize what it could not accept. Tenderness across the social ledger. "Two things," Matteo told Anna softly over a line encrypted enough to seem a war. "We can fight back publicly, expose the buyers, the handshakes, the dossiers. Or we can retaliate with precision, make their operatives trace back to their accounts, ruin reputations that ruined yours. Both are risky, both ask for fire." Anna closed her eyes. The thought of lighting an equal fire to the one aimed at her made her sick because she had fed a child and now stood on the razor edge of choosing whether to burn down lives to protect that choice. She thought of the little hands that had curled around her finger, of the lullabies she hummed, and how small it felt against the all-consuming machines of leverage. What would it mean to become an instrument in a war that never concerned her before? What would becoming a weapon do to the person who had learned to keep herself small to survive? Luca moved in response to her hesitation. He took risks he had never allowed himself. A public statement that acknowledged nothing in graphic terms but insisted on a value they would not cede. A family will not turn on someone who tended to its wounded, the statement said in guarded language. We will not tolerate blackmail. It was written with careful cruelty toward no one, and meant to signal that the Morettis could be both iron and mercy. It bought them moral space and angered their enemies, which was, in the absence of better tools, a kind of defense. The enemies escalated anyway. A late-night car bomb in a neutral neighborhood was a message dressed up like paranoia. It injured no one, but left the city's undercurrent pulsing with the understanding that prods could become shoves. The Moretti response was surgical, a targeted economic squeeze that quietly pulled business favors from the coalition rumored to be aligning against them. Friends turned from those friends quickly when profit dried up. Alliances are brittle things when poverty meets shame. But the cost of defense was not counted solely in corporate reprisals. A cousin who had coveted Luca's seat for years leaked a demand. Dismiss her, reclaimed the narrative. The council's fissures widened into a chasm. Faces that had been neutral began to weigh themselves in the ledger of survival. Luca found himself arguing not with enemies in dark rooms, but with kin at his own table who judged compassion as liability. You will lose authority, the cousin said one night, under chandeliers that had seen better purposes. You must make the hard choice. Luca looked at the sleeping infant, at the faint scar his family had earned in the market of power, and felt a radical clarity. Authority that costs what I won't bear is not worth keeping, he said. We will not throw people away to keep a cleaner conscience tidy. It was a speech that cost him. The cousin withdrew support publicly. Contracts were threatened. A board member resigned in a pique, citing principled distance. Yet an unanticipated thing happened in the wake of his decision. A small, stubborn shift of loyalty. A lawyer who had once argued for ruthless PR counters quietly stepped forward to protect Anna's legal status. A nurse who feared public censure defied gossip and wrote a cynical report that described the infant's improvement, framing the care in medical, not moral terms. Men who had seen Luca's ruthlessness now saw his tenderness a strategy, not weakness, but a form of influence that recalibrated who would stand by him. There was violence, still. A hit on a property owned by a rival signaled that Luca could retaliate without spectacle. But it was measured and cold, a necessary hush that told the city in steel terms that one could be tender and lethal in the same breath. It changed nothing of Anna's inner calculation. She had not asked for any of this grandeur. She had wanted only a chance to keep a child alive. Yet the choice she made, stay and accept Luca's protection, had become a pivot point for names and currencies she had never meant to collect. On a late night when the city exhaled and the nursery held the hush of small breathing, Anna found Luca at the window, hands in his pockets like a boy trying to look older. He did not speak at first. When he did, his voice lacked the armor of public pronouncements. They asked me to buy my authority back with someone else's life, he said. They wanted me to choose my ledger over mercy, he said. She watched him and felt in him the same fragile remaking she had felt since the first night the infant had found her breast. You chose, she said. He smiled, a small, private thing that did not belong in his world. It took me longer than it should have. She used to think power was a glass door, shut and impenetrable. Now she saw it as glass that could be opened and passed through if one dared risk the cut. They had both risked cuts to protect the baby and each other. They had traded secrecy for a brutal kind of truth. It would cost them money, alliances, easier days. But it also birthed something none of their ledgers had accounted for, an alliance not built from leverage, but from a shared tenderness that could not be entirely weaponized without consequence. They were not naive. The city kept a ledger of those who had chosen mercy and paid for it. They knew enemies would keep testing seams. But the infant, the small axis on which they had chosen differently, slept through it all, full for the first time in days, and that was a kind of victory both modest and total. Anna rested her head against Luca's shoulder, feeling a heat that was not fear. Somewhere outside, the wheels of influence turned, and the smear receded into a set of scars both visible and hidden. Inside the nursery, the tender act of feeding a child once more had redrawn the map of a family and a cleaner. And in that remapping there was both risk and claim. A new kind of protection forged in place of old dominion, and the beginning of something neither of them expected to name, but both, in time, might learn to keep. They sat in the nursery like survivors around a small, newly formed truce. Luca with his empire's bruise under his skin, and Anna with a hard-won tenderness that had become dangerous currency. Days of threats and quiet violence had changed the rhythms of their lives. Nights had taught them how to keep a child safe and how fragile that safety could be. Now the immediate fires had been smothered, the smear reduced to embers in hidden forums, and the family's board had made its choices. Some allies left. Some bargains were paid. But the infant slept, and in his steady breath there was a private reckoning that neither ledger could fully account for. Anna had paid in a different coin than Luca had imagined, not favors or silence, but the surrender of anonymity. She felt the weight of the house's protection like both armor and chain. She could buy a different life for her sister, could open accounts and fix windows that had been cracked by poverty. But she also carried new visibility that would never entirely let her be small again. She had been given a place at a table she never sat at before, and the chair fit awkwardly. Yet it was hers by choice, not charity. Luca watched her the way he had watched markets turn, clinical at first, then with an intimacy that surprised and unnerved him. He had ordered strikes and made numbers bend. He had never before allowed himself to be measured in tenderness. Protecting Anna cost him in currency his men could quantify, and in reputation no algorithm liked to handle, a softness that might be mistaken for flaw. But he felt, in a way the board had not, that some parts of power were better preserved when they protected rather than punished. He had learned to let mercy live beside ruthlessness, two tools blended like metal tempered with care. They made practical arrangements, legal statuses for Anna, a discreet stipend, vetted guards at discreet distances, and a charity front that would offer the infant a normal childhood without spectacle. Matteo and a retooled team cleaned digital traces and left honeyed false trails that lulled hunters into dead ends. Sarah, the hacker who had once tempted Anna to monetize the scandal, withdrew from the game. Some debts paid, others forgiven. Violence cooled into negotiation. The cousin who wanted a purge lost a board seat. Reputation shifted and recalibrated. What remained was intimate and human. On a rainy morning months later, Luca walked the infant to a small garden patch his family kept like a private exception to their public face. Anna followed, hands empty, shoulders relaxed in ways that once would have been impossible. They watched the child reach for a blade of grass, clumsy and certain. Luca reached for Anna's hand without thinking, fingers finding each other like roots seeking water. No declaration was needed. The world could still call what they had scandal, bargain, or strategy. Inside the hush of green, it was simply care. They had not solved the city or cleansed its appetite for spectacle. They had not erased debts or made enemies forget. But they had changed the shape of one life by refusing to sacrifice the small mercy of feeding a child. The last image stayed with Luca. The infant's palm curled around Anna's finger, eyes heavy with trust. He kept that picture like a new law internalized, the kind that insists tenderness is not weakness, but an instrument of power that reshapes what an empire can be. Anna, standing beside him, felt for the first time that choosing to stay had not been capitulation, but claim. Together they watched the child sleep, and let the rain hush the city's hunger for a moment longer, enough for them to begin again.